This is brought to you by horror, the first time America's paranoia infected the world. Every generation, the media is blamed for the unruly behaviour of the young. In the 80s, it was heavy metal. During the 90s, it was rap and computer games. Well, there was once a time when comic books were seen as the greatest danger to the youth of the world, and the American government decided it needed to do something about it. The Senate hearings into juvenile delinquency would not only change the comic industry forever, it inspired an age of true horror across the globe, allowing government-sanctioned witch hunts ruled by men like Joseph McCarthy to destroy the lives of everyday people as they looked for hidden perils in a seemingly dangerous world. And this all began with the war against comic books. With a cast that includes Alfred Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Joseph McCarthy, America's first serial killer, Albert Fish, Stan the Man Lee, and many others, Horror, the first time America's paranoia infected the world, is a tale based on the true stories of those affected by these strange times, and it's available at Marcosi Publishing and on Amazon. In part 1 of this episode, we looked at how the Australian crime writer, Vince Kelly, wrote an article with the FBI Director, J. Edgar Hoover, about the fears both Australia and the USA had for an oncoming crime apocalypse when millions of trained, bloodthirsty soldiers returned home after World War II, and the similarities the arguments for and against this idea had with the coming war around the influence of crime and horror comic books on the world's children. Well, in part 2, we'll look how, strangely, as a crime novelist and journalist, this was not the only time Kelly would be associated with the growing movement against comic books. Based in Sydney, Kelly wrote for many adult magazines and based his most popular character, Inspector Price, on an old chum from the Sydney police force, and many of Price's investigations would mirror almost exactly those of the real-life police officer, and as we will see, that sometimes got Kelly into some serious trouble. But I'll leave that for later, because amongst all the hard-hitting investigation articles that Kelly wrote, he also published 15 books on criminals and Australia's police force, and here's where that arm comes in, that we mentioned at the end of part 1. Kelly's most famous book is The Shark Arm Case, published in 1963, and it became an instant hit as there are very few people in Australia who have not heard of this unusual murder. This leads us all the way back to the aquarium I mentioned at the start of part 1. In 1939, a tiger shark was caught off Sydney's shores and was placed on display at the struggling Coogee Aquarium Baths. It was hoped such a major predator would bring in the crowds, and even today, to get up close and personal with a living tiger shark is very unusual. So you can imagine how many people began filing through the aquarium's doors. However, after about a week, and on Anzac Day, which is one of the biggest public holidays in Australia, the aquarium was filled to capacity, and that's when everything went wrong. The shark for days had been showing signs of being ill, and suddenly in front of their visiting families enjoying a day out with the fishes, the tiger shark began vomiting. Now the tiger shark, scientifically called Gallosurido cuvier, is a large requiem shark, growing to the size of 4.5 metres and weighing upwards of 600 kilos. More importantly, tigers are known to be unfussy eaters, and they will devour anything that even looks like food. And the joke is that includes car license plates. To the shock of everyone at the Coogee Aquarium that day, the tiger began vomiting out its stomach contents. This included a rat, a smaller shark, but what appeared next horrified everyone. Floating in the tank was a human arm. The police were quickly called, and the arm fished out of the water. The limb clearly showed signs of having been cut from the body with a knife, and thanks to fingerprints and a distinctive tattoo on the arm of 2 men boxing, the owner was identified as a former boxer and small-time criminal, Jim Smith. Now, Smith had been working for Reggie Holmes, a house builder who also owned a large fleet of boats, and it turns out was a drug importer and was known to run insurance scams. How were the police so well informed on Holmes's darker activities? Well, it seems Smith was also a police informer, and this is what may have led to his murder. Patrick Francis Brady, an ex-serviceman and convicted forger, joined this little gang and began helping forge papers and cheques, which the men cashed. At some point everything turned sour, and there's evidence Smith began blackmailing Holmes, perhaps to get a larger cut. What we do know is on April 7th, Smith was playing cards with Brady, and then suddenly went missing. Brady and Holmes came under instant suspicion, Yet while the forger played it cool, Holmes' nerve seems to have broken, and one night he jumped into one of his boats and headed out into the middle of Sydney Harbour. Here, he pulled a pistol and shot himself in the head. However, the shot did not kill him, and Holmes fell into the water, only to later pull himself back onto the boat and start driving erratically across the harbour. Later, a small boat with a father and his children were almost swamped by the careening motorboat. This man reported the reckless driver to the police, claiming, "You won't mistake him. He has a bullet hole in his forehead." The water police were soon giving chase to Holmes, and what evolved next was a 4-hour-long motorboat chase across Sydney Harbour. Holmes was eventually caught, and later claimed someone had shot him, and he thought the police were these same men trying to finish the job. Next came a series of finger-pointing between the two men, with Brady striking first, claiming Holmes had ordered the killing of Smith. However, the more plausible story came from Holmes, who claimed Smith and Brady were blackmailing him, and one night the forger showed up at his home and threatened him with the severed arm of Smith unless he gave him £500. Brady then left Holmes with a present of the arm to remind him he was being serious, and it was Holmes who took the limb to the ocean and threw it in, where it was clearly eaten by some passing shark. Holmes' story seemed to ring true, and when he offered to testify against Brady, the police agreed. However, the day of the forger's trial, the former drug runner was found shot dead in his car. Brady was on the hook for both murders, but turns out he hired himself a first-class lawyer who claimed that for there to be a murder trial for Smith, there needed to be a body, and a single arm just did not cut it. He pointed out anyone could have put that arm in the shark tank, including Smith himself, who may have faked his own death to escape this criminal organisation. Unlikely? Yes, but how could you prove that wasn't the case without a body? Turns out the court agreed, because Brady was found not guilty and released, though the police were sure he had murdered both men. However, 65 minutes after being acquitted, Brady was arrested again, this time for cheque forgery, though this too seems to have later been dropped as the prosecution had trouble finding witnesses to testify. Maybe they didn't want to end up in the gut of a shark. Next came the counter-lawsuit for wrongful imprisonment. Not by Brady though, but this was brought by his wife for the treatment of her husband. This too seems to have been dropped when other charges were brought against her husband and subsequently dropped again. Now, as if this story isn't bizarre enough, to give you an idea of Australia's national morbid sense of humour, many have reported that the following day of Brady's acquittal, one Sydney newspaper carried the following headline: "Of course you are innocent, Mr. Brady, but please don't do it again, Mr. Brady." I will note here, I think this may be part of the growing myth around these murders, as I have looked everywhere for this newspaper headline, and so far have not found it anywhere, and I've looked. So if anybody out there knows which newspaper it was in, please send me a message. Now, the story of this bizarre murder grew in fame when Vince Kelly wrote The Shark Arm Case in 1967, and his book was helped by the crime writer maintaining strong ties with both the police and many politicians. However, these relationships did not always help him out, leading us to what this has to do with comics. My book Horror is all about the move against comic books in the years after World War II, and in 1950 a minister in the Australian state government of New South Wales brought a charge against a comic that had been recently printed inside the Sun newspaper. Now, at the time, comics were big business, both in issue form and inside the numerous tabloids that most people got their news from. Who doesn't recall getting the Sunday paper and pulling out the thick comics page to catch up on the latest adventures of Tarzan, the Phantom, Dick Tracy, Ginger Meggs, or maybe even Spider-Man? Today, with the loss of these newspapers, it's hard to imagine just how important the comic section was for these tabloids. In the 1940s and 50s, comics were the single greatest consumed media product, outstripping movies and even radio. They were seen as being so important. In Australia, a mini-war erupted in the nation's newspapers, as each tried to outdo the other by offering the latest, most exciting comic strips, and thus ensuring a boost in sales. This comic war became so heated that newspapers started running ads explaining to everyone what new strips they had coming up. In 1949, the Sun began advertising something of a coup for the paper, that one of Australia's most popular characters, Inspector Price, was leaving the adult-style magazines it had been populating for the last decade and joining the funny pages on Sunday. Many of us today have never heard of Inspector Price, a crime series written by Vince Kelly that began life in 1943 as a series of thriller pulp crime novels, and had become so popular, a movement grew in the nation to turn them into a locally produced radio play to take on the more famous US shows. In an interview, the author explained Price was based on real-life cases from Australia of the late Sydney Inspector, William Pryor. Now, the policeman was a good friend of Kelly's, and his stories were hugely popular and widely read for nearly 2 decades, with short stories and novels appearing in various magazines across the country and the world. Inspector Price was so popular, he even began taking over the covers of these magazines. One thing that helped? After the war, crime stories were popular amongst the returning servicemen, who had become interested in harder, less childish stories. And this was being reflected in a lot of comic books at the time, especially in the US, in series like Crime Doesn't Pay, and the brand new series hitting the shelves, EC's Crime Suspense Stories. This popularity was also being reflected in Australia's newspaper comic sections as well, with the 2-decade-old Dick Tracy joined by a comic version of Inspector Price. Written by Vince Kelly and drawn by artist Steve Richardson, the crime-solving adventures of Inspector Price hit the Sunday funnies at the end of 1949. And though the art was slightly cruder than the slicker US comics, the series seemed to have been a very popular one, as it dealt with a world Australians knew. Yet the realistic nature of the crimes and the outright violence depicted in the art soon brought complaints from various groups. These were not just letters to the editor, by the way. Groups like the Bowral High School Parents and Citizens Association began a campaign of writing to the Minister for Education, the New South Wales State Premier, and even the nation's Prime Minister. The problem was, there was a sequence of stories that ran in early 1950, and in this story, a sexual deviant was stalking and hunting young women who he'd ambush and strangle, leaving their bodies in some exposed area to be later found. The criminal was eventually caught because Inspector Price noticed that the knot that the strangler used was one that was taught by the army, and thus it had to be an ex-military serviceman. Now, I'm no prude, and I've been mostly on the side of the comic industry in my books and various articles about a lot of this censorship being imposed on the comic industry at the time. But on this one, I think everyone had a point. Remember, this is in the Sunday comic supplement meant for young kids to get their silly on, and just look at these images. Women being strangled. Their dead bodies left exposed. Their open-eyed, open-mouthed faces showing the horror of their ends. Some even show the rope still hanging around their dead necks. Reading through the series, this was not an unusual event, but these particular images are the worst of the lot. Yet it was clear from the very first issue this comic story was meant for a much older adult audience. I mean, it even had a naked woman's body right there on the first page. Again, I don't have an issue with comics or the stories. Nudity, crime, violence. But clearly what's happened here was a series written for adults and generally only available in adult-style magazines and books had been hastily shoehorned into a comic strip, with no one stopping to think exactly what the audience for the Sunday comics section was. Yes, adults bought the newspaper, but the comics section was purely for young kids. Well, it turns out one politician agreed. In November 1950, the New South Wales Chief Secretary, Clive Evatt, sent word to The Sun that they needed to remove the comic strip from their Sunday comics page. This move was immediately praised by various organisations who had been having a serious issue with the comic. A week later, Sydney's various newspapers contacted Evatt, asking for a comment from his office on the fact that The Sun pointedly ignored his request by printing the next instalment of Inspector Price the following Sunday. Evatt gave no comment. Then. A week later, however, he announced his office was starting a prosecution against the Sunday Sun for, quote, a breach of the Obscene and Indecent Publication Act. Evatt then ended this statement by admitting that what happened next was completely up to the Sunday Sun. And what happened next must have caught him by complete surprise, as the newspaper came out with the very next issue of Inspector Price without a single word said. Exasperated, the paper was then hauled in front of the New South Wales courts. The police were also asked to step in, bringing their own charges against the newspaper. When the whole matter finally showed up in court, the state's prosecutor later explained the comics were in grossly bad taste and showed a disregard for children who were the market for this filthy matter. In response, the defence didn't even answer these questions, but posed one of their own, that there was something behind this prosecution. The defence then questioned Sergeant Ronald John Walden, the police officer who had brought the 4 counts of publishing obscene material against the newspaper. In court, while giving evidence, when he was asked if he found the material personally objectionable, the policeman admitted he did not, and that's the way it was reported in many papers. But I think that this is somehow missing the point. A grown man could like what he wanted, but this comic had not been produced for him, but for small children. And in one rare newspaper I found this was not all the police officer said, because Sergeant Walden then admitted as much when he next noted, "Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I cannot say what effect it could have on children." So just like in the US with Dr. Frederick Wertham, the courts next decided to do just this and called on a psychiatrist. Dr. Charles McCarthy noted the central character named Harry was a depraved individual who might be imitated by undisciplined and imaginative children. And it wasn't just the police. The Australian Journalists Association is on record as having tried to use their influence to stop the comics series, and they also appeared in court asking to make a statement. The judge, however, ruled against them. However, their representative, W.C. Mosley, was not one to be silenced, and if he could not have his moment in court, he most certainly could in the nation's newspapers. So he then released his statement to the general public. The Australian Journalists Association is strongly opposed to the publication of any comic or adventure strip, Australian or otherwise, which is obscene or places undue emphasis on sex and crime. You just know there has to be some sort of but coming. The association is also opposed to the erratic, discriminatory and inconsistent administration of the law by this Chief Secretary's Department in this particular prosecution. In other words, yes, comics like this should not be given to kids, but no, they did have an issue with the government trying to censor this comic. Their reason is obvious. Many admirable Australian strips have been wiped off the Sydney market by the flood of cheaper American comics. The release then noted a number of US comics that carried equally objectionable material, and that the government didn't seem to have any issue with these. In selecting one of the few surviving Australian strips for the sole prosecution, the Chief Secretary's Department is straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. What? I think what they're saying is that they're taking on something small and ignoring the much bigger problem. And to reinforce just what the AJA's positions was, out of a total of 100 comic books appearing regularly on the bookstalls of New South Wales, more than 80 are drawn overseas and syndicated here after they have circulated in America and other countries. And these have continued without interference from the Chief Secretary's Department, which has concentrated its attention unfairly on one Australian strip. And just to remind you, this was about a comic that didn't have a few colourful words or suggested sexy women or a few wild punches thrown. It was about this image being presented to small children. And again, we go back to the beginning of their statement. The Australian Journalists Association is strongly opposed to the publication of any comic or adventure strip, Australian or otherwise, which is obscene or places undue emphasis on sex and crime. If only they had reread their opening line. Now, I think the AJA statement is so strongly worded as they knew the comic was seriously a problem and the courts were likely going to rule against the newspaper, which was a form of censorship that every journalist should stand against. Admirable, true, but I think they were in the wrong on this particular one, because this was a seriously disturbing comic. After everyone was heard, the courts rested and decided to ponder the matter. Though who knows what sort of influence reports like this from Mosley had on the court, which soon ruled that there was nothing objectionable about the comic, and the case was dismissed. This was not the end of the matter, however. For the New South Wales government minister and the newspaper, a war of words began, and it continued for a whole year, and it got seriously nasty. The minister, Evatt, made statements in Parliament against the paper and the comic's author, Vince Kelly. And the newspaper swung right back, calling out the minister on every occasion for every decision he made, and seemingly making it their mission to end his career. After a year of to and fro, Evatt would later point out all he had done was ask the newspaper to not print an offensive comic strip to children. And woe any politician who ever made such a move against a newspaper in the future. And our story doesn't even end here. In court, one of the witnesses in the case against Inspector Price had pointed out that Kelly had based many of his stories on the career of Sydney Inspector William Pryor. This left me thinking, was the cartoon that had caused so much anguish in the Sunday Sun based on a real crime? It turns out it was. And I found the link in one of the witnesses' statements, where he agreed that the comic was likely based on a real case, the Craig murders. I now had another thread to pull, and what unravelled is something truly disturbing. In 1932, the strangled and naked body of a young girl called Bessie O'Connor was discovered in the Royal National Park. The police soon focused on Eric Roland Craig as the murderer, because several witnesses had claimed to have seen the driver of the stolen car that had taken the girl out to the park. There was a suggestion Craig may have even murdered other women, but the prosecution seemed to have focused on this single murder, likely as Bessie O'Connor could generate a lot of sympathy to their case and help convict Craig, because she was from a well-known family and all the other women were clearly prostitutes. What seems to have occurred next is something of a total farce. Craig went to court, and there was so little evidence he was acquitted. So the prosecutors simply arrested him again and tried again. And again, their case was so weak, Craig was acquitted. As they say though, third time lucky. And with witnesses saying they were being heavily leaned on by the prosecution and still claiming they could not be 100% sure Craig had been the man driving the car, and some witnesses stating firmly he was not the man, they managed to not only get a conviction, but a death sentence. Now, if this isn't disturbing enough, it turns out the prosecutors even had evidence Craig wasn't the guy, and other witnesses had been struggling to give their testimony why he wasn't the killer. Yet not only did the prosecutors block their testifying, they never even let the defence know this information was out there to be found. Luckily, however, Craig's death sentence was commuted to life, and though Craig continued to claim his innocence, the years ticked by with him in jail, though he would eventually be released, change his name, and live the rest of his life seemingly at peace. And again, we are not done. In 1950, perhaps because of the reappearance of the story in the nation's newspapers, thanks to the link between the Inspector Price cartoon and her husband's supposed crimes, the former wife of Craig committed suicide. And we're still not done with the tragedy. Recently, a new book from Tanya Bretherton titled The Killing Streets not only questions the entire case against Craig, but her investigation suggests that thanks to the police dropping the case as they believed they already had their man, they completely missed a serial killer operating in Sydney for 2 decades. In fact, the murder is looked to have begun in 1922 and may have ended as late as 1946. These women had all been beaten, raped and left naked under trees in parks, and they're all found in roughly the same region. Later, when interviewed about her book, Bretherton said, "I was shocked more had not been done to investigate what were really horrible and public crimes, but then sadly she admitted that it was just not a high priority for the police because the women were prostitutes." The author would also point out there is absolutely no way that a killer will ever be found, a bit like the Jack the Ripper murders. The problem is, too much time has gone, and at the time, because these were prostitutes, not a lot of work was done by the police. These crimes were not taken seriously, they were not investigated thoroughly, and so there is very little evidence to go on. But the point is, if the police hadn't concentrated on Craig at the time, if they had allowed all the evidence to be seen, if they had truly done the work, they would have maybe noticed that all of these crimes were linked and that this serial killer may have been found much earlier, and perhaps some of the women, especially the later murders, may not have been committed and that criminal could have been actually caught. Who knows? So that's our tale. Vince Kelly, a man who stood against the idea that crime and horror could influence returning soldiers from the war, who wrote about this with J. Edgar Hoover, would write about some of the most famous crimes in Australia, including the bizarre shark arm case, and whose own crime series would come under prosecution for obscenity. A comic based on a crime and a prosecution that may have accidentally hidden an operating serial killer on the streets and parks of Sydney for a quarter of a century. I guess only in the funny pages. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you hang around for future stories. I have a couple more coming up that I think you will find very interesting. And don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and hopefully I'll catch you in a future episode. Bye. Horror, the first time America's paranoia infected the world, is available at Marcosi Publishing and on Amazon. The following songs: VHS Dreams, Hide and Seek, Void Glider, Fiddly Dee, and Dead Spawn were created by Shane Ivers and can be purchased at www.silvermansound.com.